Good evening, everybody. Hi. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to tonight's program. My name is Luke Andreso, and I'm an intern here at the Jefferson Educational Society. It's my pleasure to kick off tonight's event, and I'm here to do three things. I'm here to go over some housekeeping notes, tell you about some upcoming Jefferson events, and introduce tonight's presenter. First, the housekeeping. If you need assistance during the event, please feel free to find me. I'll be in the back if you need help with anything. And some reminders for the question and answer portion. After the presentation, please raise your hand to be called on, and please project your voice as best as possible so our speaker can hear you. And please try to keep your questions brief and precise, and try to refrain from offering lengthy statements. Now on to some upcoming events. Tomorrow, Tuesday, March 25th at 6 p.m., Charles Gray and Matthew Platts will be at the Corey Higher Educational Council to present fiber optic broadband, how this infrastructure shapes the future of rural spaces. And then this Wednesday, March 26th at 6 p.m., Dr. David Frew will be presenting a lecture at the Harbor Creek Township Building titled Lake Erie Fish Wars, Shots Fired at Local Fishermen. Lastly, I would like to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. Ghosheh. Dr. Ghosheh is a scholar-in-residence at the Jefferson Educational Society and an expert in Middle Eastern studies. He holds a PhD in economic development from SUNY Buffalo and taught at Edinburgh University until his retirement in 2022. A native of Jerusalem, he has lived in 8 countries, traveled to 59, and has taught in Japan, China, Russia, Italy, and Morocco. A Fulbright scholar, he has conducted research in Malaysia and Singapore and was recognized as Pennsylvania Geographer of the Year and Edinburgh University's Educator of the Year. Without further ado, let's give a warm JES welcome to Dr. Ghosheh.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming tonight. I know we have an easy topic to discuss, so it'll take us a few minutes. Usually this will take years to discuss an issue this complicated, but we'll try to do our best in the next 50 minutes. We'll leave some time for questions and answers. I'm sure many of you have questions. So I'll go over some history. Some of you probably know this, but some don't. So we'll try and start at the beginning. Israel is a tiny country the size of New Jersey or Massachusetts. But this tiny country, with only about 1% of the region's, the greater Middle East population, has been at the center of tension and attention. 1% of the greater Middle East population attracts the most attention. The area that we now know as Israel and the Palestinian territories has been inhabited for thousands of years. This is one of the areas that we know as the cradle of civilization, stretching from Iraq all the way through Syria, Lebanon, connecting with Israel, Palestine, and Egypt. This area has been populated for so many thousands of years continuously. Just about everybody has lived there. If you want, you can look at maps of war, and it will show you who controlled this small territory over what period of time. So, going back to the early Iron Age, everybody has controlled this area for a short period of time. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Jews, the Romans, the Arabs, Crusaders, the Mamluk Egyptians, and the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, was the last great empire to control West Asia and North Africa, the greater Middle East, at least the populated areas of that region. So if we go back in history, we'll see just about everybody has lived, conquered, controlled that territory. And usually, we did not have small, tiny countries. We had big empires. The Greek, the Roman, the Turkish Ottoman, large empires that included this small territory that we call the Holy Land, for lack of a better term. So it was part of a big, great empire until recently, probably 100 years ago. The end of World War II is when things started to change. World War I. Thank you. So, again, as part of the Great Ottoman Empire, it was what we call a small state or province. The Turks call it wilayat, means states. So the Turks controlled all of this area. You notice that the desert area wasn't that important to them. They controlled the coastal areas, stretching across West Asia and North Africa. As the Turkish Empire was weakening and collapsing, the European countries started to take big chunks of its territory. The Russians took a lot of Central Asia. The British and the French took places like Egypt. The Italians took Libya. And the big change happened at the end of World War I. I know many of you probably have seen Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia tells the story of maybe betrayal and division. Lawrence of Arabia was sent to the Arabs in what's now Saudi Arabia to convince them to rise against the Ottoman Turks. So the majority Muslim Arabs were to fight the majority Muslim Turks in alliance with the British and the French in hope that after the war, the Arabs will gain independence and we'll have an Arabistan, a country that's bigger than the United States, will have a larger population than the United States, and will have half of the world's known oil supply. Obviously, that did not happen. So Lawrence of Arabia actually quit because he saw that he made these deals and he was deceiving these people unknowingly because people in London had other plans. So when the war was over, they divided the spoils of war. Some areas were to be directly controlled by the French. The coastal areas are important. Let me go back. The coastal areas were especially important. What is now Syria, Lebanon, southern Turkey. Some areas, the desert area, will be indirectly under French rule, and some areas will be under British rule. Again, the coastal area, which is now southern Iraq and Kuwait, the Gulf region. And look at this territory here. This was supposed to be an international zone, condominium. Eventually, the League of Nations established it as a British mandate. It was supposed to be a French mandate, but the British negotiated with the British. The British convinced the French to give it up to them. So the Holy Land was subject to British supervision. That's what the mandate was supposed to be. A temporary supervision until the locals get their act together, have self-governance. That's 1917, 1918, until 1947-48. So a brief period of time. 30 years of British and French rule changed the entire region. We have the fragmentation of the region and the creation of many small, unstable countries, usually with artificial boundaries, boundaries that do not make any historic sense. They don't reflect ethnic division, tribal divisions, sectarian division, and in most cases, with a minority in control of the country. So that minority would be beholden to the colonial power and will be dependent on them for protection and will do their bidding in exchange. So we'll provide you with protection, but you have to do what we tell you to do. There's a price to pay. So Iraq got to have a Hashemite king from Saudi Arabia. Syria got to have a Hashemite king from Saudi Arabia. Jordan got to have a Hashemite king from Saudi Arabia. Eventually, Shia majority Iraq was ruled by the Sunni minority. Sunni majority Syria was ruled by the Shia minority. Muslim majority Lebanon is ruled by the Christian minority. So you see that in case after case after case. Eventually, these were the finalized borders of the region. So we have the establishment of British-mandated Palestine. You will hear that often, from the river to the sea, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. That's what they mean, from the river to the sea. And of course, we have Syria. Syria, in this case, minus Lebanon, which was established as a Christian country, even though the majority were Muslim. Kuwait was taken away from Iraq and established as a separate country, which led to many problems in the future. This part of Turkey was taken away, this part of Syria was taken away and given to Turkey. So we have the fragmentation of the region. So this is the territory we're talking about, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. Again, 10,000 square miles in New Jersey or Massachusetts. We're not talking about a large territory. The Europeans have been trying to deal with their Jewish problem for a long time. The German solution was, let's kill as many of them as we can. And they killed 6 million of them. But the rest of the European countries decided, maybe there is a better way. Maybe we can establish a Jewish country somewhere else and export our Jews to this country. So they thought about some ideas. Where can we send them? Let's send them to Uganda. That was actually one of the first choices.
They actually looked at Montana.
Yes, they looked at many places. They looked at many places. They actually suggested at least 8 different options. And Jewish delegations went to Uganda and thought, well, this is a nice place, except there are too many damn lions. And at that time, that was a serious problem. So that's why they rejected the idea of Uganda. And you'll notice China, sending the Jews to China, they were actually considering that. This is Japanese-controlled part of China, northern China. Siberia, Russian-controlled Siberia. So that's not Russian territory. This is the Asian conquest of Russia. Argentina, Palestine. And they finally decided, well, Palestine would make sense because the Jews have a historic ties to Palestine, have religious ties to Palestine, and it's close to Europe. So they settled on Palestine. So the British decided, the Balfour Declaration, the infamous Balfour Declaration, Her Majesty's government is committed to the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So we will establish a Jewish country in Palestine. Of course, the British told the rest of the world, oh, don't worry, we will protect the rights of the non-Jews who live in Palestine, who happen to be at that time 98% of the population. So this is a European idea that we're going to establish a country for European Jews in the heart of the Arab Muslim world and export their Jewish problem to the Middle East. So Jewish homeland in the heart of the Arab and Muslim world. The founder of Israel and the first prime minister of Israel, until recently, the longest serving prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, famously said, Israel is in the Middle East, but is not of the Middle East. Might be in the Middle East, but it's not from the Middle East. It was established for European Jews. So this is the state of Israel, again, a tiny little country, and this is the greater Middle East. All of this is a Muslim region, and in the middle of that Muslim region, we have a Jewish country established by the Europeans. Did the Europeans bother to ask, is that what the people of the region want? Is that what the people who live in the Holy Land want? They did not bother to ask. They didn't bother. Again, Winston Churchill used to brag, I create a country with the stroke of my pen. And they did. They issued that declaration. So once the British took control of the Holy Land of Palestine, they allowed Jewish migration. Mostly European Jews migrating into Palestine. Remember, in the 1930s when Jews were persecuted in Europe, not too many countries accepted Jewish refugees. Even the United States turned away Jewish refugees. So one of the few places they could go was Palestine, which was under British control. So when we look at where did the immigrants come from, look, you can see Eastern Europe, Central Europe, other West. You can add these, talking about 95% of the immigrants coming from Europe. 90% of the immigrants coming from Europe. So mostly European Jews migrating into Palestine. Later on, after the establishment of Israel, we had other migration, North African migration, migration from the former Soviet Union, but initially, almost exclusively European Jews migrating into British-mandated Palestine. Of course, not surprisingly, we have friction and conflict between the Jews who are coming to build a country in Palestine and the Palestinians, who are mostly Muslims and Christians, who did not want a Jewish country in their homeland. They wanted to have their own country. So the British decided maybe we can split the baby. Maybe we can. We said we are committed to establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but not in all of Palestine. So we can establish a Jewish country in part of Palestine and give the Palestinians the rest of the country. So they established the Appeal Commission, which went to the region and studied the issues and decided, let's establish an Israel, a Jewish country, on 20% of Palestine, and we'll have a Palestinian country, an Arab country, for the Muslims and the Christians on 80% of the land. This was 1937. They made the recommendation and they left. World War II broke out and everybody forgot about the Peel Plan. It was never implemented. So during World War II, more Jews were killed and massacred in Europe. So at the end of the war, the problem was turned over to the United Nations. And the United Nations decided, let's divide the land. The idea of two-state solution is a good idea. We still talk about the two-state solution today, but you'll see it has changed over time. So the United Nations decided, let's split the baby, but not 80-20, maybe 50-50 or 55-45. So this is the original two-state solution. An Arab-Palestinian state on 80% of the land, and a Jewish Israel on 20% of Palestine. This is the Peel Plan, and you will notice that almost all the plans had the area around Jerusalem and Bethlehem would be an international zone. This is a city that's holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and everybody should have access to their holy sites. That's what the British thought. That's what the United Nations thought. Now, the United Nations, when they decided to divide the land, they looked at the numbers. What percentage of the population are Jewish? What percentage are Arab, non-Jews, Muslims and Christians? And you will notice here that most of these cities had a solid Arab majority. There was only one city that had a Jewish majority, Tel Aviv. Even after all this European Jewish migration, 70% of the population was non-Jewish. They looked at land ownership, and you will notice Arab ownership versus Jewish ownership. the Arabs still owned 90% of the land. So you own 90% of the land, you still have 70% of the population. When they divide the land, what do you expect? You expect at least 70%. So what did the United Nations do? The United Nations at that time had 51 member countries. And the vast majority of these countries were European countries. The rest of the world were still colonies, have not gained independence. Now we have 193 countries in the United Nations. But this was predominantly European. So this is how they decided to divide it. Divided into an Israel and Palestine, but Israel will get 55% of the land, and the Palestinians will get 45% of the land. And not just 45%, they would have 3 different separate enclaves. So this would be the Arab Palestine, and this will be Jewish Israel. You will notice Jewish Israel is bigger. Jewish Israel is contiguous. The Palestinian state is divided into 3 different territories. And in the heart of the biggest territory, we have an international zone. So not surprisingly, Thomas Friedman wrote a famous book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, while he was a correspondent in Beirut. And he was studying the issue, and he said, for the Jews, half a loaf was better than none. They were given actually more than half a loaf. For the Palestinians who own 90% of the land and still make up 70% of the population, and the rest, most of the Jews were recent immigrants, 45% was not acceptable. So the Jews accepted it, the Palestinians rejected it, and that's what started the first war. The first war meant, even though the Jews were only 30% of the population, these European Jews were much better educated, and the British have allowed them to be armed and be trained, whereas the Palestinians were not allowed to own any weapons. If you owned more than a 2-inch knife, you would be hanged to death under British rule. So we have the war. The Arabs, of course, outnumbered the Jews, and then they had Arabs coming from Jordan, from Egypt, from Iraq, from Syria. You would think they would overwhelm the Jews. Israel defeated the combination of these Arab armies, who were poorly equipped and usually led by British officers. And Israel not just controlled 55% of the land, Israel ended up controlling 78% of the land. Not the land that the United Nations gave them, but also some additional land. So Israel did not just end up with 55%, ended up with 78%. What was left? 2 territories you hear a lot about, the West Bank and Gaza. That's what's left. That's the 22% that's left. At that time, people thought, this is tiny territory. 22% is not enough to establish a country on. So Jordan took over the West Bank, and Egypt took over the Gaza Strip. And we'll talk about the Gaza Strip. It's less than 1/10 the size of Erie County. So we have establishment of Israel. As soon as Israel was established, the Israeli Knesset, parliament, adopted the law of return. The law of return simply states, if you drive to Pittsburgh or Cleveland, you will often see signs, birthright. If you're Jewish, you have a right to migrate to Israel and become a landed immigrant. The moment you land at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, you are an Israeli citizen. You are automatically. Because you're Jewish, you're entitled to it. So that's what birthright meant. So what we have is mass migration of Jews from over 100 different countries. Many came from places like the former Soviet Union, over 1 million, from Poland, from Romania, from Ukraine, And of course, eventually from other countries in the region, in the Middle East, from France, from the United States. Many Americans migrated to Israel. So this is the last wave of migration, about 1 million. Once the Soviet Union disintegrated, about 1 million Jews, or who claimed to be Jews, because many actually were not, and decided, I just want out of Russia or Ukraine, and the only ticket out of here is to claim that I have Jewish descent, and then you can migrate to Israel. So about 1 million migrated in the 1990s from the former Soviet Union. So when we look at the population composition, we can see a dramatic shift in population. Under Turkish Ottoman rule, the population was 86% Muslim, 12% Christian, and about 2% Jewish. Once the British took over, you can see that that's starting to change with Jewish migration. We still have 82%, 10-8, but you can see the Jewish population increasing from 2% to 8% to 17%, 31%. Now it's about 76%, 76, 77%. So dramatic shift in population. The Christian population is decimated, came down from 12% to 2%. The Muslim population came down from 86% to 21%. Of course, because of the War of Independence, many of the people who lived in Palestine fled the war. Many thought I would come back when the war is over. But when the war was over, we were not allowed to return. 700 towns and villages were destroyed, so people could not go back to their homes. So we have two migrations: mass migration of Jews into Israel and exodus of Palestinians out of what is now Israel. So in migration and out migration. So we have about half of the entire Palestinian population live outside of Palestine, British-mandated Palestine. About 7 million Palestinians are refugees outside of Palestine. Some went to Jordan, some went to Egypt, some went to Syria, some went to Lebanon, some went to Iraq, some came to the United States. So Jews from 100 countries came to Palestine. Palestinians left Palestine and went into many other places, including Gaza and the West Bank. Now, Israel is a tiny country, but has been the single largest recipient of U.S. aid: financial, economic, and military. And that's not counting the recent aid that we got in the last few months. Another $20 to $30 billion worth of aid. So on a per capita basis, Israel received more aid than the entire continent of Africa, with 1 billion people. So many people have been talking about this, like, why are we giving all this money and weapons to Israel if it's not doing what we want Israel to do? If Israel claims to be our ally, why won't they listen to us? So, especially when they don't allow humanitarian aid, food, water, medicine into Gaza. Now, Israel is a multi-party democracy, and every democracy has its problems. We know our democracy has its problems, but in a multi-party democracy, you have to gain a majority. And because they have so many different parties, it's impossible for one party to gain a majority. So you form a government by forming a coalition. And in Israel, sometimes you have 28 different parties competing for votes. Now, they have cut down on this by raising the threshold of what percentage of the votes you need to gain to get any seats. It used to be 1%, there is it to 1.5%, to 2%, to 2.5%, to 3%, to 3.25%. So, if you're a small party and you get 5 seats, and this right-wing coalition has 57 and the left-wing coalition has 58, your 5 seats are going to make the difference. You can decide who's going to rule, but you can extract a heavy price for it. And that's what's been happening in Israel. The big party might get 30% of the vote, but they need the smaller parties to form a coalition. So initially, Israel was founded by European Jews, and most of these Jews came from Eastern Europe, and they were socialist in orientation. So Israel was established as a socialist country. Israel still have kibbutzim, communities where people basically collectively share everything, and nobody owns anything. You share the responsibilities and you share the resources. Many American college students, actually, when they travel to Israel, they go and stay in a kibbutz. You can stay there for free. You have to probably work 4 or 5 hours. They provide you with a place to stay, provide you with food, and they provide you with pocket money. So that's an easy way for you to get to know the country and to be part of a community. But things have been changing in Israel. Many recent immigrants are ultra-religious, not socialist, not well-educated like we had from Eastern Europe. And those right-wing, especially the ultra-Orthodox, have larger families. So if you divided Israel into 2 groups, the secular and Reform Jews, liberals, and the religious Jews, especially the ultra-Orthodox, they don't work, they don't serve in the military, and they have many children. On average, 7 children per family. The secular Jews have 1 child per family. So these people don't work, don't serve in the military, and are dependent on government handout. And these are the people who work and bleed and serve in the military, but the ultra-Orthodox are trying to tell them how to live their life. So we have this huge division. Again, they don't serve in the military, and they're dependent on taxes that the liberal Jews are paying. And then they still want to tell everybody else how to live. During the Sabbath, there is no bus service. The malls should close. Restaurants can't operate. So you have a very different Israel, depending on which part of Israel you go to. You go to the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, or to a westernized neighborhood. Do you go to Tel Aviv, or do you go to Jerusalem? So the ultra-Orthodox are basically taken over Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is very conservative. And then you have Tel Aviv, which looks like Israel's Miami. So you have the contrast between the two. So in many Israelis, like, well, I'd prefer to have a non-Jew neighbor than an ultra-Orthodox who's trying to tell me when I can drive, when I can go out, and when I can't. Of course, Israel was established through war, the War of Independence in 1948, and since then, it has continued to have many, many wars. We don't need to go through all of these, but this is a list of the wars that Israel has been involved in. 1948, 1956, the invasion of the Sinai Peninsula when the Suez Canal was nationalized by Egypt. Israel occupied the entire Sinai Peninsula, an area 5 times the size of Israel. 1967, we'll talk about this because that's the war that basically decides what happens now. Because during that war, Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, was supposed to be the Palestinian state. They also occupied the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria. Now, they made peace with Egypt and gave all of the Sinai Peninsula back. During the Sadat regime, President Carter negotiated peace, and he was trying to end the conflict and establish a Palestinian state. But at that time, the Israeli prime minister would not go for it. So they made peace with Egypt, but did not finish the deal. And Carter wrote many books. One of them probably is we'll talk about. If Israel does not make peace, it will have no choice but to become an apartheid state. So he wrote a book called Peace or Apartheid. There are no other options. You can have peace or you can become an apartheid state. So we can see that there are many Gaza invasions. This is not new. Every 2-3 years we have a Gaza invasion. The war did not start on October 7th. The conflict did not start 2 years ago. This conflict goes back to World War I and the British control of the territory. So this is the changing boundaries of the region. This is the UN partition plan. This is when the first war of independence, 1948, Israel occupied not just the area that was allotted to it, but 78% of the land. That's what's left, Gaza and the West Bank. And Jerusalem was divided into east and west.
What caused British to create the changes at the end of World War I in 1970?
Again, the British thought they can get away with whatever they wanted. They promised the Arabs independence and reneged on that. And they made a secret deal with the French and the Russians at that time to divide the Ottoman possessions between the three colonial powers. So they did not honor their commitment to the Arabs and the Sharif of Mecca, who basically made that agreement with them. And instead they said, well, we'll install 3 of your sons as kings, one to be king of Iraq, one to be king of Syria, and one to be king of Jordan. Now, the king of Syria thought he was a real king and wanted to assert his independence, and the French shot him dead. The king of Iraq, obviously he's from Saudi Arabia, not from Iraq. The Iraqis did not want a Saudi ruling over them. So they actually bombed the royal palace and everybody in it. That was the end of the Hashemite dynasty in Iraq. The only Hashemite dynasty that survives today is Jordan. And the current king of Jordan had to learn Arabic because he was actually educated and his mother was British. I listened to him give the first speech as a king. You could not understand what he was saying. Because he spent, I guess, some time in the desert with the Bedouin tribes, hoping to learn Arabic, but he still had a lot of trouble pronouncing Arabic. He was British educated. He spoke English as his native language. So it was a hard time. That's the current king of Jordan. So now, having controlled, occupied the West Bank, Israel has built a lot of Jewish settlements. So when Israel talks about, okay, we will give the Palestinians some land, what do we want to give them? This area. The area in orange or pink. So we're not talking about 80-20 or 55-45 or 78-22. The Israelis are talking about 90-10. We'll take 90 and we'll give you 10. With a lot of back deal negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, with mediation from Norway, they signed the Oslo Accord in 1993. And many people thought this would be the end of the conflict. The Oslo Accord came up with this simple formula: land for peace. Israel will give up the occupied territories. Palestinians will have their own country, a Palestinian state, and then we will have peace. So a Palestinian homeland in the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital. West Jerusalem could be Israel's capital. Have a transition of 5 years. And after 5 years of negotiation, Israel basically will withdraw from the occupied territory and will end the conflict. We might have some compensation for the refugees because they can't go back home. If 7 million Palestinians went back to Israel, it becomes a Palestinian state, not an Israeli state, because there'll be more Palestinians than Israelis in Israel. And Israel will give back the Golan Heights to Syria and will end their conflict with their Syrian neighbors. Now, you know as well as I know, 1995 plus 5 equals never. Never happened. So it was never implemented. Every American president has come up with a plan. Clinton had a plan, Bush had a plan, Obama had a plan, everybody had a plan. So Bush had a roadmap to peace. It was supposed to take 3 years. We know Bush has been out of office for more than 3 years. Nothing happened. So unfortunately, many of these roadmaps, peace plans, are just on paper. The Quartet, the United Nations, the EU, the United States, and Russia had a plan of their own. Again, the same thing. Land for peace. Did not happen. Obama had the same thing. We need to end this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The only solution is a two-state solution. There is no question that the absence of Middle East peace does affect U.S. national security and our interest in the region. It's in our interest to have peace in the Middle East. But we have not been able to do it. Now, many prime ministers in Israel came close to finalizing a deal. In the 1990s, before Benjamin Netanyahu came to office, we had Rabin as prime minister. And Rabin was actually trying to implement that 5-year plan. But before he could implement it, he was assassinated. A radical nationalist Jew shot him dead in what's now Rabin Square in Tel Aviv. And that was the end of the peace process. In 2007, 2008, Ehud Olmert was the prime minister, and he is from the right-wing Likud party. And he actually was negotiating an agreement. So we can give you most of the West Bank back with minor changes in boundaries. This is his peace plan. He was actually negotiating with Abbas, and he drew this map. We'll take over this territory over here from the West Bank, this territory over here, this territory. In exchange, we'll give you this, we'll give you this, we'll give you compensation. So 95% of the West Bank will go back. We'll take 5%, and in exchange, we'll give you a corridor that connects the West Bank and Gaza, and we'll compensate you for the land. Ehud Olmert was accused of corruption and spent 2 years in jail. So the plan was never implemented. So we've come close on many occasions, just never. Saudis came up with the plan and introduced it multiple times. The Saudi peace plan is similar. Again, the same idea. Full Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied Arab lands in 1967, accepting a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and the Arab state will have normal relations with Israel, end the conflict. Solution to the refugee problem, either compensation or resettlements. So that's the problem. Land, we can add to the land, refugees, water, who controls how much of Jerusalem, who controls security in the West Bank and Gaza, the border areas especially. Now, since the Oslo Accord, Israel has been building Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Started off with few settlements. 1993, the number of Israeli settlers was 180,000. Today, we have over 1 million. So while they've been talking, oh, we're negotiating peace, but we're taking more and more of the land, and establishing colonies in the West Bank. Yesterday, actually, the cabinet decided to recognize the independence of 13 of these settlements. They will be independent. So they haven't had any serious negotiations. What's left of the West Bank if you look at all of these Jewish Israeli settlements? So Israel's idea is, we will give you the cities. So this will become like Native American reservations. You will get the cities, but we will get the land. So changes, what's left for the Palestinians? The Palestinian towns and cities, and Gaza. Maybe, I don't know. Gaza is now a question mark. So we're getting to this. So this is the two-state solution over time. 2080, 45-55, 22-78. Is it going to be 22 or less? That's the quick question now. One of my favorite, I guess, newspapers in Israel is Haaretz. Haaretz is the land. It's a popular newspaper. It's often very critical of the government. And maybe this sums the conflict in the region. And this is not new. You can go back 15 years. At that time, Brad Burston was summarizing the conflict. The problem is on both sides of the conflict, Jews and Arabs. We have Jews and Arabs who want compromise and peace, and we have Jews and Arabs who want to demonize and eradicate the other. Israel has had an unstable government between 2019 and 2023. 2022, they had 4 elections in 3 years. No government lasted more than a few months. Finally, they got an election where we had a decisive result. Decisive means in Israel they have 120 seats in the parliament. You need 61 to form a government. The current government has 64. That's considered stable, 64. But if any one party with more than 4 seats left that coalition, the government would collapse. Now, how did they get this? How did they get this current government? The Likud, the largest party, Netanyahu's party, got 32 seats. 32 out of 120, about 1/4. You can see that some of the smaller parties, Religious Zionist, National Unity, Shas, United Torah, Israel is our home, got few seats. Look at this party. What's this party? Meretz? It's the Peace Party. How did they get 0? You needed 3.25 to get any seats. They got 3.24. There were a few thousand votes short of getting, if they got 3.25, they would have had 4 seats. And the two coalitions would be split 60-60. So a few thousand people, now millions of Israelis took to the streets after the elections, just like millions of Americans are taking to the streets now. It's too late. Should have turned out and voted. They did not. So if these millions of people who took to the streets voted, the vote will be different. Now, the ultra-Orthodox turnout rate for them is 90%. Turnout rate for the young, educated, Western-oriented elite, 50%. For the Palestinians that live in Israel, 40%. If they made it to 60 or 70%, they would have dominated the government. But they did not for that reason. Now, some parties were allowed to contest the election this time that were banned before. Banned because of their racist ideology. These are the two characters that we'll focus on. Ben-Gvir, indicted 54 times for incitement. Not allowed to run before. This time they allowed him to run. His party has 5 seats. If he was not allowed to run, no right-wing government. But we have a right-wing government with 2 racist ministers that no American official would meet with, no European official would meet with. So this is right after the election in 2022, millions of Israelis took to the street, no to fascism, no to ultra-Orthodox dictates. We don't want this fascist right-wing government. But it was too late. You didn't vote. And that's what you have now. Biden refused to invite Netanyahu to the White House. That's the first time Prime Minister of Israel was not immediately invited to the White House. And this new government had an agenda to expand settlements, take over all of the West Bank, annex the West Bank, kill the peace process. Now we have a new militia. These settlers were usually protected by the military. Now he's actually providing them with weapons so they can protect themselves. They're not protecting themselves, they're attacking Palestinian villages nearby. Restrictions on the freedom of worship for Christians and for Muslims. Christians were upset when the Israeli military told them you can only have 5,000 people celebrate Easter at the Church of Holy Sepulchre. This was the first time ever that a government would tell you how many people can celebrate Easter. So this is before what happened in Gaza. So things were not hunky-dory before October 7th. We have a lot of problems. So this new government policy basically wanted to annex all of the West Bank, and this reminds us of what President Carter talked about. You can have peace or you can have apartheid. And the one country that knows the most about apartheid is South Africa. And South Africa is the one that went to the International Court of Justice to accuse Israel of apartheid and genocide. Not an Arab country, South Africa. So quickly, we're going to go over the Gaza Strip. This is the Gaza Strip, a small strip of desert land. You see that it actually has coastal area. 25-mile long. At its widest, it's 6 miles wide. So it's about 140 square miles. Not very large. Small territory. Now, some important facts about Gaza. The majority of Gazans are under 18 years old, children. The majority of Gazans are refugees. About 80% of people who live in Gaza are not originally from Gaza. They took refuge in Gaza, or their parents or grandparents took refuge in Gaza when Israel was created. Their homes are in places like Haifa and Jaffa and Lod and Tel Aviv. So they live in refugee camps. Their income is very low, about $200 a month. That's before the war. Much lower than the West Bank. The West Bank is slightly better at 323. Unemployment was almost 50%. This is before the war, the last war in Gaza. Gaza, described as the largest open-air prison in the world, encircled by Israel. Israel controlled the land, all the land borders, the airspace, and the water. Fishermen were only allowed to fish up to 2 or 3 miles. The Israelis decide how far out you can go. If you go more than the 2 miles they assign you, they will shoot at you. So, the Attorney General of the United Nations, again, this is before the war. Conditions for children in Gaza are hell on earth. That's before the war. This is the kind of conditions people were living in Gaza. How does it compare to Erie County? 140 square miles. Erie County has 1,558 square miles. It's less than a tenth the size of Erie County. So think of that when you think about how many bombs were dropped on Gaza. Population, 2.3 million. 9 times larger than the population of Erie County. It's 100 times more densely populated than Erie County. 100 times more densely populated. One of the most densely populated territories in the world. We know that Hamas took over power in 2007. During the Obama administration, President Obama had the idea that maybe we should export democracy to the Middle East. We can have elections in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood won. And again, they overthrew the monarch, the president, the military dictator at that time, one of the 3 military officers that ruled over Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, the Arab Spring. He thought the same thing would happen in the Palestinian territories. So they had elections. The Palestinians in Gaza decided to elect Hamas because they thought Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, was corrupt and they wanted a change. Now, Hamas was allowed to rule in Gaza and Israel was funneling money to them. Every month, Hamas was getting $30 million a month from Qatar through Israel to Gaza. The Israelis have allowed this to continue, which strengthened Hamas. Meanwhile, the Palestinians that made peace with the Israelis in the West Bank, they were taking their money away. Israel collects taxes on imports to the West Bank. This money is supposed to be transferred to the Palestinian Authority. Israel has been taking most of this money and not given it to the Palestinians. So this is the irony. Netanyahu and Hamas, most of the time, this is the Times of Israel, a conservative newspaper. Most of the time, Israel's policy was to treat the Palestinians with contempt and as a burden, and treat Hamas as an asset. The right-wing government of Israel treats Hamas as an asset. Netanyahu propped up Hamas, allowed funding to flow to Hamas. Money to Hamas is part of strategy to keep the Palestinians divided. Netanyahu's policy strengthened Hamas. So, Haaretz, that newspaper that I was telling you about, Netanyahu developed this and advanced this destructive world doctrine that held that strengthening Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority would be advantageous to Israel. He wanted to say, we have nobody to negotiate with. We can't negotiate with Hamas, and the Palestinians are divided. So he weakened the Palestinian Authority and strengthened Hamas. So we know Hamas waged an attack on October 7th, killing 1,200 Israelis, about 1,200, and kidnapping 240 Israelis to the Gaza Strip. So this is the beginning of the last cycle of violence. Certainly not the first, and I don't think it's going to be the last cycle of violence. This is one of the problems. 100% of Gazans, 2.3 million people, have been forced out of their homes. Most of these homes have been destroyed. For much of the last year and a half, all of these 2.3 million have been confined to 11% of the Gaza Strip. Remember, this is 1/10 the size of Erie County. What's 11% of 10%? 1% of Erie County is home to 2.3 million Palestinians. So the majority don't have any food. Now, Hamas is not a major military power. It's a militia. They do have light weapons. They don't have an air force. They don't have tanks. They don't have military ships. They don't have radar systems. They don't have bunkers. They have some homemade rockets with light payloads. This is what, when we started the war, 3,000 Hamas rockets injured one Israeli citizen. One Israeli bomb killed 500 Palestinians. 2 days ago, one Israeli bomb killed 400 and injured 500 more. Just 2 days ago. Israel is the supreme military power in the region, has one of the largest and most advanced military equipment in the world. So it's not a war to speak of because there is absolutely no symmetry. David and Goliath, this David is Palestinian, not Jewish. So what do the Israelis want to do with the Gazans? You can see what some of the leading officials in Israel were talking about. Let's nuke them. Let's send them somewhere else. The idea that President Trump was talking about, forcing these Palestinians out of Gaza, it's not an American idea. It's an Israeli idea that's been debated for years. Netanyahu sold him on it, and he thought he came up with an original idea. So this is what Gaza looks like. It's been bombed into the Stone Age, literally. That's what Gaza looks like. One way to put it, in the war in Gaza, they dropped more bombs than that were dropped on London, Dresden, and Berlin. And Gaza is 1/10 the size of Erie County. They dropped the equivalent of 2 nuclear weapons in 1 month on Gaza. This is what Gaza looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. President Trump was talking about maybe we can establish the Middle East Riviera.
Yeah.
Well, I got news for you. It was the Riviera before our bombs destroyed it. That's what Gaza looked like 2 years ago. And that's what it looks like now. So before and after pictures, devastation. If we look at any loss of life is tragic in either side. 1,200 Israelis were killed on October 7th. This is as a few days ago. The number now is 50,000. 50,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. About 14,000 more are expected to be buried under the rubble. They can't be removed yet because they don't have the machinery to remove them. Since October 7th, 1 Israeli has been killed by Hamas in Israel in this 15, 16-month period. Millions of Gazans, 2.3 million of Gazans, have been forced out of their homes. A few thousand Israelis have been forced to leave their homes. Many of them have returned. 500 medical personnel have been killed. Over 150 journalists have been killed. Over half of all the journalists killed in the world last year were killed in Gaza. Hundreds of UN personnel have been killed. Over 100,000 Palestinians have been injured. So, yes, we have focused on the Israeli hostages. Well, what about the Palestinian prisoners? There are tens of thousands of Palestinian prisoners. Since October 7th, Israel has arrested about 10,000 Palestinians. They can arrest thousands more today if they wanted to. There's nothing to stop them. How many will be released? They released some of the Israeli hostages. 32 Israeli children were killed, and that's very tragic. Over 16,000 Palestinian children have been killed. So there's no symmetry. There's never been any symmetry between the two. What will happen next? What's going to happen? How will this end? Again, President Biden and Secretary Blinken were talking about the two-state solution. Bill Clinton said Netanyahu is the killer of peace. Netanyahu brags, I'm the only one that can stop the creation of a Palestinian state. The United States was trying to get a grand compromise, peace between Saudi Arabia, even an alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Saudi Arabia said the price would be a Palestinian state. Of course, Israel would not buy. So the two-state solution, there is no other option for peace in the region than the two-state solution. That's what most of our leaders tell us. That's what the rest of the world believe. Now, many countries, Spain, Norway, Slovenia, have recognized the Palestinians. More are recognizing Ireland. The United States has protected Israel and shielded it from the international community, from UN Security Council resolutions. So, UN Security Council votes for a ceasefire. Only one country votes against it, us, the United States. And we have a veto power, so nothing happens. UN Security Council, again, votes for it. We vote against it. We were trying to get this grand bargain. We were trying to get out of the Middle East. And the way for us to get out of the Middle East is to get Arabs and Jews, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, to become allies. We were trying to create a NATO-like alliance in the Middle East, a Middle East Treaty Organization that includes Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Morocco, so we can have our allies take the burden away from us and contain the growing influence of Iran, of Russia, of China. So we can focus on the Pacific and on China. What's stopping in the way? Israel refused to compromise. Netanyahu is probably the only reason that did not happen. So we've had many ceasefire proposals, even an Israeli ceasefire. Israel came up with this proposal. And then when Hamas agreed to it, Israel rejected it. This is what our leaders were telling us. Why did Israel reject its own proposal? Because if we have a ceasefire, the government in Israel would fall. People in Israel want fresh elections, and they want an investigation on how could October 7 happen. Israel is supposed to have the leading spy intelligence agency in the world. They control the skies over Gaza 24/7. They have spies in Gaza inside Hamas. The son of the leader of Hamas was spying for Israel. So how could they not know? How could that happen? So Netanyahu does not want the war to end, because an end to the war would mean the end of his regime.
For sure.
So the current proposal for peace is not new. This is the same proposal they had about a year ago, in May of last year. 3 phases. Hamas would release women, children, the elderly, and the sick. Israel will release 500 Palestinian prisoners, will withdraw from populated areas in Gaza, and then we'll start to talk about formalizing the ceasefire, permanent ceasefire. Phase 2, Hamas would release men and remains of Israeli dead in Gaza. More Palestinian prisoners will be relieved. Israel will withdraw from Gaza, and they complete and finalize the ceasefire agreement. The goal is to have permanent ceasefire, cease hostility. They finished this part, and then Israel said, we don't want to go to phase 2. We want to control parts of Gaza, the borders with Egypt, the area that divides Gaza into 2 halves. So they implemented the first phase and refused to go to the second phase. This is the ceasefire that we have now, negotiated after literally years of negotiations. So hasn't been fully implemented. The UN Security Council has supported it. The United States has supported it. Both Biden and Trump takes credit for it. But what happened a few days ago? The war is ramping up again. Why? Most Israelis believe that this is happening because the end of the war would be the end of Netanyahu. He was in court last week because of corruption. People have demanded an investigation in the October 7 attack. How could that happen? Israel can see everything that happens in Gaza. How could they not see that happening? So, many countries are condemning these attacks, but look at us in the United States. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations blames Israeli airstrikes in Gaza on Hamas. Again, these are bombs provided courtesy of Uncle Sam, our tax dollars. What's important for us to understand is this is not new. The asymmetry in the casualties is not new. Don't look at the last 15 months. Look at any year. Number of Israeli killed, number of Palestinians killed. Number of Israeli killed, number of Palestinians killed. Year after year after year after year. There is no symmetry because the Palestinians really don't have much weapons to fight with. Israel blockaded Gaza since 2007. They've been living in prison for 18 years. What will happen if the war ends? Will Gaza be rebuilt? It might be rebuilt. Some would estimate it will take many years and $80 billion to rebuild it. Who's going to pay for that? Where would the money come from? Who's going to rule Gaza?
Riviera.
Oh,
Riviera.
maybe we can. Who's going to?
Trump's Riviera.
Well, but where would the money come from for Trump's Riviera? Oh, us?
Yeah.
We paid to destroy it. We have to pay to rebuild it so we can destroy it again? So this is the complicated problem. Many Arab countries said we would help rebuild on the condition that we don't want this to happen every 2 years. Because we have rebuilt it before and you destroyed it. We have rebuilt it again and you destroyed it. If we're going to rebuild it, we want to have permanent solution. We want to have peace. Now, many Palestinians in Gaza would say, okay, you don't want Hamas to rule over us. Why don't you allow us to have elections? Maybe Hamas would lose. Remember, half of all Gazans are under 18 years old. They did not vote for Hamas. They weren't even born when Hamas took office. And at that time, Hamas did not get a majority of the vote. They got a plurality of the vote because they have many different factions competing in the elections. And people hated the corrupt Palestinian Authority. They did not necessarily love Hamas. They wanted a change. We wanted a change. We have a change election here every few years. Doesn't always work out for the best. Not for them, not for us. What's stopping elections in Gaza? Israel. Israel refused to have elections in all the Palestinian territories because that will include 400,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. They were allowed to vote in Palestinians' election before. Israel refused to allow them to vote now. And the Palestinian Authority, I mean, the guy in office now, Abbas, his term has ended many, many years ago. But because there have no elections, he continues to be president. That's one way to be president for life. You never hold elections. And you can blame it on your enemy. So that's one of the basic problems we have there. I know we've covered a lot of issues. Wanted to leave some time for questions.
My big question would be, why does the United States have to seemingly support Israel? We've had issues with them with apartheid. I mean, they should have. We didn't support South Africa.
Well, we were one of the last countries to actually join the boycott of South Africa. We're always late to the game. Now, why does the United States support Israel? Probably many different reasons. But one of the main reasons is the largest contributor to Trump's election is not who you think it is. It's not Musk. It's the Adelson family. And that's why Trump agreed to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
So oligarchy.
The money talks, and money corrupts elections, and money has poisoned our elections. Special interests have a lot of influence in our government. That was true before, that's very true today.
Why did Biden keep it up?
Again, many think of Israel as an important base for us to exert influence and control in the Middle East.
Yeah, but when they're devastating another population,
I mean,
it's just
Biden himself said this was over the top and withheld some bombs from Israel. So we did not give them 2,000-pound bombs, but we gave them 1,000-pound bombs. They can use two for the price of one.
right.
We have bases in 180 countries.
Right, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
That Israel's not the only
I know.
place.
And you look at our allies in the region, they're mostly non-democracies. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, Morocco, monarchies, dictatorships. These are our allies. Their people don't want us there, but they don't have a say. So, does it make sense? I think if you want to give aid, you can make it conditional.
Right.
I will give you aid, but I want you to do this. If you don't do this, you don't get it.
Right.
Basta.
So, I mean, that's what many Americans were thinking. Unfortunately, the government was not responsive. And the last election, I mean, one of the big issues in the last election was Gaza. A lot of young people stayed out, did not vote because of Gaza. So when they go back and look at what happened, that's one of the big issues.
I think the Arabs in Detroit had second thoughts after the election.
Absolutely. Again, be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. And they did. And is that going to work out better for them? We'll find out. Any other questions, comments?
How will it end?
How will it end? Oh my goodness. Such an easy question, right?
I don't think it is.
Now it depends on many factors, including us. I think if Trump is serious about ending conflicts and not getting involved in wars, then ending this conflict would be very easy. You can get the Arab countries to get Hamas out of Gaza militarily, but they can be part of the community still. So Hamas is not just a militia or an organization. They're also a charity. They provide food and medical services, just like many organizations in the region. So how can they do this? You can make a bargain. Hamas leadership would leave. We can have a technocratic government in Gaza. And then we can have maybe even Arab peacekeeping force that will help rebuild Gaza. But that would mean Gaza would be independent. We'll have long-term ceasefire with Israel so you can have a reconstruction. And ideally, eventually, you will have to have a compromise where Israel will end its conflict with its neighbors, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Syrians, because we don't want to continue to arm them and provide them with aid year after year to destroy and then to rebuild. It's not in our interest, not in their interest.
Are the Gazans and the Egyptians friends?
Good question.
They have a border.
The Gaza actually was ruled by Egypt from 1948 until 1967. During the 1967 war, Israel occupied Gaza. Now, Gazans are Palestinian, not Egyptians. They speak the same language. The majority are Muslim. There are Christians on both sides. But they've had good relations until recently. Hamas is considered a chapter or a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood that ruled over Egypt during the only democratic elections in Egypt's history. When Morsi became president of Egypt, they had good relations with Gaza and with Hamas. When the current president staged a coup and took over the government, Sisi basically threw out the Muslim Brotherhood president in jail where he died under suspicious circumstances. So Egypt has been cooperating with Israel on this blockade of Gaza because they hate Hamas as much as Israel does, or maybe more, because they see it as a threat to them. The idea of Islam in politics is not received well in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE. So all these countries want Hamas defeated. They might be Arab brothers, but they have their own agenda. So all of them want Hamas out. Now, some Palestinians might want Hamas out as well, if it means peace for them. But we will know this unless we have elections. So having a ceasefire, long-term ceasefire, reconstruction, elections, maybe independence or autonomy would be steps to having regional security and regional peace. And we probably are the only country that can make it happen because we have the greatest influence on Israel if we choose to exercise it.
Yeah.
So far, we have not done so. If Biden told Netanyahu, if you don't agree to this grand compromise with Saudi Arabia, we won't give you any weapons, Israel would come to the table the next day. But we did not do that. We have a great deal of influence. We have never used it. We've allowed Israel basically to tell us what to do. They take our money and they do whatever they want. They take our weapons and use them any way they want. So again, by law, by American law, when we give you weapons, you are restricted in how you can use them. You can't use them against civilians. But we have done nothing about it.
So what keeps Hamas fighting? I mean, do they figure they'll just be, executed if they surrender, or do they think they can keep fighting and
Well, many
achieve something?
Many of these Hamas fighters have been killed, but imagine if you're one of these 50,000 Palestinians who've seen their mother, brother, daughter, children killed. What are you going to do? You're going to pick up the fight. So for every Hamas fighter Israel killed, Hamas is recruiting 2 or 3 more. So if you want to end the conflict, you need to end the conflict through negotiations, through peace. You can't continue to kill the other side and expect them not to fight back. If somebody came to the United States and invaded us, don't you think we would fight back? Of course we would.
Would the United Nations ever step in, like in that Palestinian?
What's stopping the United Nations? The U.S. veto. The U.S. have exercised the veto power 46 times to prevent the UN Security Council from taking action. Can the United Nations take action? If the U.S. would just abstain, the conflict would have ended long time ago.
So we all have to call our Congress people.
I don't know if they would respond now, but we've had our chances
I always say,
under different
you
administrations.
don't complain if you don't do anything, you
Yeah,
can't complain.
absolutely. I agree with you. I think we should reach out to our senators. Our senator was just taking pictures with Netanyahu, Fetterman. So again, every senator and every congressman in the United States has been to Israel. It's like a ritual. Before you take office, you go to Israel, and they will show you we're a small country, we're a weak country, we're defenseless. Never mind that we're the supreme power in the region, and we can collectively defeat the armies of all the countries around us. So Israel has 10 million people. Egypt have 100 million. Israel has defeated Egypt on multiple occasions. Not just Egypt, but a combination of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, or Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. So the Israelis pretend that they're the victims. The numbers speak for themselves. These are the victims on both sides. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.